What's going on, guys? Nathan here, back again with another Magic the Gathering video. Today we are talking about 5 hot takes that I have for the Commander format, and we are going to don our thick skin and our ironclad armor and go battle and die on the hill for these various bullet points that I've typed up here. I've got some notes, make sure my arguments are rock solid. But before we get into these interesting hot takes, I'd just like to ask, if you enjoy this content, leave a like on the video and subscribe if you enjoy my content in general. I come out with it every week, and so by subbing you can be sure to stay tuned for all of it. And of course, lacking a sponsorship, today our comment of the week is brought to us by Mighty One 3737. This was on my video where I talked about replacing Commander's Power 10 scale with a Power 5 scale as being more appropriate for grading your decks. And he says, keep in mind when I'm actually talking to humans, I just use tiers to describe decks, mostly CEDH, which would be about the 9 and 10 range, high power, which is about 8s, mids, which is about 7s and 6s, casual 4 to 6, and jank 1 through 3. And then he says, if people ask what I mean, then I probably throw out a number and cross my fingers, which I think is the best you can do with a power level scale that uses a numerical value. And I think ultimately this person is agreeing with my thesis from the video, where ultimately I think that you could just collapse the power scale down to 5 and have that be just a better way to grade your decks. And also props to Mighty One for typing out the longest comment I've ever seen on a single YouTube video. It was definitely an interesting read. This is the longest comment I've ever seen, bar none. And I can't believe it's on one of my videos. So props to you, Mighty One, for typing all of that out, and thank you for your contribution. So today we are talking about 5 hot takes in the Commander format. These are ranging from very spicy takes to perhaps some lukewarm takes, admittedly. And our first one here, I'd like to jump in. Harmonize is better than Guardian Project if you are not in Elf Tribal. Now, the reason why I caveat the Elf Tribal thing is a lot of one-drop mana dorks, you can just get a lot of value out of Guardian Project. Now, Guardian Project, of course, says whenever a non-token creature ETB is in your control, you draw a card, whereas Harmonize is simply a draw 3-card sorcery, both costing 4 mana. You might be wondering, well, the ceiling on Guardian Project is so much higher than Harmonize. Why would I ever play Harmonize? And the base argument, I think, is that Commander has sped up so much in 2024, where it would appear to me that drawing 3 cards now is better than drawing, let's say, 4 to 5 cards in 2 to 3 turns. Now, my assumptions here is that ultimately with Guardian Project, in most green decks that aren't running a lot of 1-cost mana dorks, you are probably going to average out 2 to 3 CMC with your creatures. So if we just say, 2.5, right? So if you drop Guardian Project on turn 4, let's say you're playing on curve, by turn 5, you will drop, with 5 mana available to you, you will drop 2 creatures onto the field. Now, you'll draw 2 cards off of that, and you'll pass, and the next turn cycle, you'll have potentially 6 mana, and you'll drop then 2 additional creatures on the field, which means that by turn 6, you've drawn 4 cards. Of course, the assumption here is that Guardian Project will stay on the field, and not that it's destroyed right away. But I've noticed that with Guardian Project, you are reliant on drawing or having creatures in hand once it is on the field in order to get that value, and you have to hope that it is not destroyed. I have been burned by top decking Guardian Project with an empty hand before in Commander, and perhaps it's this bias that is pushing me towards recommending Harmonize instead, but I think that genuinely I would rather draw 3 cards off of it just immediately for 4 mana than have to wait for additional creatures to come up in my deck from the Guardian Project. Now, there's a saying in finance and accounting that you want to accelerate your revenues and defer your expenses. And ultimately, if you take that to the extreme, it means that you are more wealthy essentially by accelerating your revenues, as long as we can just push those expenses off off into the future. So with Harmonize, I think that really embodies this notion that we want our value now. With turns only lasting, between 7 to 9, I would say, in an average Commander game, if you're playing at a mid-power, or I should say a mid-casual power or high-power pod, you simply do not have the time for Guardian Project to deliver you value in 2 or 3 turns. And so I have noticed that I would rather have in my hand, I'm happier to top deck a Harmonize in the late game because it's going to deliver me value immediately and requires nothing else to deliver that value. So it does have a higher floor than Guardian Project, but it doesn't have that higher ceiling. And I would argue that you are going to have a more consistent play experience and a more consistent deck overall by running Harmonize to ensure that you will always be drawing those cards, always make sure to hit your land drop, etc., etc. Also, Harmonize solves for if you are missing a land drop on any given turn. Let's say you have 4 mana, you're missing that 5th land, you can fire off Harmonize without having to worry about having anything else in your hand, and then draw that card to make your land drop so that you are not put out of tempo, essentially. Harmonize, I find, is not as good in the early game, specifically turn 4 or 5. Of course, with Guardian Project, you have the time to accrue value, but I have completely taken Guardian Project out of all of my decks because I find that you simply cannot rely on its value without getting blown up right away, especially if you're in an interaction-heavy pod. So I just think 4 mana to do nothing is too slow in Commander, and the format is increasing speed over time, and so I think over time Harmonize does get better because it delivers a no questions asked 3 cards, and it asks nothing of you, essentially. It's also quite a cheap card. If I actually look here on Scryfall, I think it's like a 30-cent card from New Capenna that I'm seeing. So you can get this on the cheap as well. And let's actually look up Guardian Project's price. I don't think it's a particularly expensive card, but let's just pull it up here. It is a $8 card. Okay, so while Fallout, I guess, with the reprint is down to $7, but you're paying, I don't know, 8 times, even more than that, 24 times the price of Harmonize for what I consider to be a less consistent effect. Now, where Guardian Project really excels is obviously, like I mentioned, the cheap, low-to-the-ground creatures, and so I think that's where it should be run primarily, if you can reliably be dropping mana dorks all the time. And also, if you're running big value decks that like to flood the board with non-tokens, so any sort of deck where you are playing like a Savala Stampede or something, where you are trying to spew as many creatures on the battlefield as you can. You're running more of the value generation type of spells like Savala Stampede or Itali Primal Conqueror, something like that, rather than something where you're playing, 1 creature at a time. That's first hot take number 1. Harmonize better than Guardian Project. Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. My next hot take is a 2-parter. This is Diabolic Tutor is not bad, and I think tutors in general should cost 4 mana to be quote-unquote fair. I think that Diabolic Tutor should have been the standard for what a tutor should cost in Commander, and the current meta of running Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, all of this other stuff, it's just too cheap for what tutoring does for you, and I think that overall tutoring is very undercosted in Magic as a whole. While this is the opposite of my previous point, where Diabolic Tutor is essentially a 4 mana do nothing, I think that the act of tutoring is powerful enough in itself to justify doing that because it is always the best card in your deck anytime it is in your hand. So the way that I sort of like to frame this is that if you are willing to pay an extra 4 mana for whatever you need at any given moment, let's say you're in a big green go wide deck and you have a board assembled, you're ready to swing for an Alpha Strike. Would you pay 12 mana to play a Craterhoof Behemoth from your deck? If you are facing down a giant board full of creatures that are about to murder you, would you pay 10 mana for a Farewell? Or perhaps, if we use an even better example, because Farewell is actually a rather expensive board wipe, would you pay 6 mana for a Vanquish the Horde? And I think that in a lot of situations, I think that you would. I think that Diabolic Tutor is completely playable because it is still eliminating variance, albeit at a higher cost than what we're used to. But the act of eliminating variance and ensuring that your deck always does what it is intending to do, in other words, following your game plan, leads to games being won, and therefore will improve your win rate by a ton. And this is why I'm also willing to play it's the Golgari 4 mana tutor effect that also searches up a basic. I can't remember, but I'll have that included here in the video. I'm willing to play this card in Golgari decks because I think that, even a 4 mana tutor with a tapped land, if you sort of do the mental gymnastics of paying 1 to search for a basic and then play it, with that being a tapped land, is a very, very good card because it is always going to be whatever you want it to be, whether in the early game it's a land or in the late game it's your best card that you could want in any given moment. So I think that Diabolic Tutor is completely playable. Is it good? I mean, it's obviously not as good as Demonic Tutor, right? Nobody can argue that. It's just going to cost 2 more mana for the exact same effect. But what I would like to posit is that Demonic Tutor in general is rather undercosted, and honestly, you would improve your deck by putting Demonic Tutor into it if it can run it. And this goes into the whole conversation of, do you want to run tutors in your deck, yes or no? Because if yes, you're eliminating the variance, eliminating a little bit more of the fun in your deck. The flip side being that your deck can do its thing more and win more, right? So you're just increasing EV at the cost of fun. Personally, I do not run almost any tutors in my decks. In fact, I would just rather draw cards because I think the act of drawing cards is more fun. The other argument that I would posit here is that 4 mana should be the baseline for unconditional tutors. Currently, I believe 3 mana is sort of the going rate. If you exclude Demonic Tutor as being its own anomaly, the rate for an unconditional tutor is 3 mana. And I think that it should be 4 mana instead. I think that 4 mana should buy you an unconditional tutor. I think, if I had my druthers, right, just ban all of the tutors except for 3 and 4 mana. 4 mana you get unconditional, right? And then 3 mana you would get conditional. So I think 3 mana would be like Solve the Equation, for example, where you can only search for an instant or sorcery or something like that. And then you would do like a 2 mana, I would bump up Enlightened Tutor and other tutors, 1 mana tutors that go to the top of your library to be 2 mana instead, just because I think that in general, fixing your game plan is incredibly powerful because it is always going to represent the best card in your deck at any given time. And I think that tutoring also lends itself to what I call the coiling viper meta, which is a brand new term I'm going to coin. You heard it here first, folks. The coiling viper meta is essentially a strategy in Commander where you want to be non-threatening in the early and the mid game. And so that's where you're going to coil, right? You're going to build a lot of value. You're going to get ready for your storm turn. Ultimately, kind of like Richard from NFG Goldfish says that every deck is a storm deck in 2024. And I think there's some truth in that statement, where you are waiting until you hit, 6 or 7 mana to absolutely go off, pop off, generate a bunch of value, and then, either swing out on turn 8 or turn 9. If you're doing combat or your, storm turn in literal storm decks, or aristocrats, sacking a bunch of stuff, burning the whole table on that turn 8 or turn 9. And so tutoring lends itself to the strategy very well because you want to appear non-threatening in the early and mid game so that you don't get targeted first, right? You always want to be the third deck to pop off, essentially, assuming that you don't get killed by the first or second decks, because those decks should, in theory, be more likely to encounter a lot of interaction. And so in the early game, if you are ramping, that is generating resources without appearing too threatening on board. In the mid game, if you fire off a Diabolic Tutor, for example, or any other tutor effect, you are still appearing non-threatening, but you have gathered important resources that is hidden information to your opponents. If you were to have to reveal cards that you would tutor up for any tutor, for example, I think that, this principle or argument that I'm putting forth would be violated a lot more. When you tutor something, it is still gathering resources because you're essentially eliminating variance in your deck, while at the same time getting the exact resource that you need to ensure that your game plan pops off in the late game. That is why tutoring is so dangerous in Magic, because everybody forgets about the guy who tutors 1 or 2 times in a row. I mean, in a casual pod at least. In CEDH, this is a completely different story. Players are a lot more aware of tutors and will often try to shut that down. But in a casual pod, tutoring has this magical effect where people have the memory of a goldfish, where you might tutor something to hand and it is the card that will win you the game, but because it's hidden information, everybody sort of just forgets about it and it stays in your hand. It doesn't stick in people's head that, holy crap, he just tutored something unconditional, right? I better go kill him. You don't get that response because naturally, because of hidden information, it sort of just fades from people's eyesight and memory, essentially. So a little bit of a conversation about tutoring here, but ultimately I think that it is one of, if not the most powerful things to be doing, short of perhaps ramp in the early game. And so I think that in general, if I were to wind back the clock to the 90s when Magic was first introduced, tutoring would definitely cost probably 1 more mana than I think it should today, or than cards are being printed today. So anyway, hot take number 2. Hot take number 3 is perhaps less of a hot take. This could be lukewarm and it might even be icy cold. I'm not sure. This might just be actual good deck building advice. But I do think that every commander deck, if you are playing once again in that sort of casual 7-ish level of deck, that you should be dedicating 1 slot to Lifegain, or run a couple of incidental life gain effects in your deck. Now, what I mean by this is if you have a slot in your deck that is intended for a fog, perhaps consider Riot Control as that fog option, which can net you 10 to 20 life. Perhaps consider Crypt Incursion as your piece of Graveyard Hate, which can also net you 10 to 20 life, depending on if there are spicy graveyard decks at the table. If you're in a token deck, for example, you might consider Benevolent Offering, which can swing you a ton of life points in the green. And so I've seen this argument a lot in YouTube videos and just, I suppose, Reddit discussions as well, where people don't think life gain in Commander is as effective. And I would definitely agree that it's not as effective in 60-card formats, but I do think that decks have to go the distance in order to win, right? The goal in a commander game is to be the last person standing, not to be the first one swinging. And so that means you need a high level of survivability, which means that you need to be gaining at least a little bit of life over the course of the game, because what we're seeing, and I'm actually going to lean on my previous analysis that I did a while back. I'll actually have that video linked in the description. You can see a meta-analysis, and I'm going to jump to Excel here. A meta-analysis that shows what are the most common ways that you will die in any given commander game. So this is, I pulled in the top 50 commanders on EDH Rec, our step 1 analysis, and we basically plotted out, okay, what are the strategies that they're employing to win the game? And there are certain weightings placed on these. For example, the Ur-Dragon is mostly going to be pumping out a lot of big creatures, right? But then it also has a few cards that are core to the strategy that involve burning out the table, that deal damage. For example, Tear of the Peaks deals damage equal to the creature's power when it ETBs. Okay, so we gather all of this, we sum all this up, and what do we get as a weighted average? So I'm going to call this the weighted prevalence percentage. So what we're seeing is that commanders overall want to overrun the board with creatures. About 26% of the efforts in the top 50 commanders are dedicated towards overrunning the board and slamming big creatures on the field. Next, what we see is 12%, we have burn and drain. So these would be your Sir Conrad type of effects, your Torbrand type of effects that are going to be very aristocratic burn or pinging and any other burn amplification type of effects. So there are two primary strategies that you need to defend against when you are considering how to survive into the late game. So in order to turn off creature overruns and also turn off burning and draining, we can employ Lifegain as a strategy to at least be the last one to survive, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is, let's say we played a card that says your opponents just can't deal damage one at a time, or your opponents just can't deal non-combat damage. Okay, so that's not as good for us to play on the table, A, because it paints a giant target on your back, but B, because when decks are ready to deal damage to your opponents, you want them to deal that damage, right? Because otherwise, it's your job to deal that damage to your opponents. You do want your opponents to be dealing damage to your other opponents. That's an asset, right? So the way that we kind of look at this is, if you want to be the last one to survive, you either have to remove the thing that's going to deal damage to you before it deals damage to you, or you could just let it do its thing against your opponents, but then employ a strategy so that you aren't affected as much. And that's where we see effects like Ghostly Prison be good, Propaganda, for example, because it turns off alpha strikes while also enabling your opponents to point their creatures in another direction, which is advantageous for you. The point I'm trying to make is that Lifegain allows you to out-survive your opponents while letting your opponents deal damage to each other, and that is a win-win for you because your opponents are being dealt damage and you are gaining it back. That does not, I think, counter the fact that you are, and let me switch back to our background here. I don't think that that negates the argument that, well, people are going to swing for 80, so, you know, it doesn't matter, right? But it can help go the distance in the slew of decks that you'll face over a long period of time. That's sort of my argument here, and I think that's where I will wrap up hot take number 3. Let me know what you guys think about that in the comments below. Hot take number 4 is jumping off of a previous point that I made earlier in the video, that hyper-efficient value engines will get you killed first, and that is why you should not run them. So examples would be, and these are higher power commanders, but if you are running Chulane, Edgar, Kalia, Mirim, Joda, Animar, Corvold, all of those commanders have reputations, and if you run those commanders, you start with a target on your back. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that all of these commanders have one thing in common, and that is that they snowball. And when you are snowballing, you do want to snowball with your deck, but you don't want to be the first one to do it because, like we mentioned before, at the start of a game, everybody has all of the interaction ready to go, and so the first player to pop, even the second player to pop, probably will encounter a decent amount of interaction, whether that's targeted or otherwise. And I have noticed in most commander games, you will encounter a board wipe between turns 4 and 6, something like that. And so you want to be doing the coiling viper meta, sort of like I touched on before, where you're not really committing to the board super heavily. You're maybe just playing some cards that will draw you some cards, generate blockers. Ramping is super huge. I mean, ramping is exactly what you want to be doing in the early game, just because the first person to play those scary targets are going to have removal on those targets. And so we want to wait for that first board wipe, that inevitable board wipe between turns 4 and 6. And then we deploy once all of the other decks have been dumpstered. Now, it's not like you can rely on that board wipe, right? So it's a very tricky balance. And this is one of the trickiest parts of Commander, I think, is determining when to commit to the board and when to sandbag. And I think that you need years of experience in Commander before you sort of sniff out when it is safe to commit and when it is not. And to be honest, with so many cards unknown within your opponent's decks, that's not even going to be, a reliable gamer instinct, I suppose you could call it. But I think the point here is that you don't want to be the first deck to pop. So let's not play the decks that pop first, right? Let's not paint the target on our backs. Instead of Chulane, perhaps we might play Galadriel instead. And you have a little bit more of a slow roll, but that ensures that you are not targeted immediately, first of all, and that your commander is not a remove on sight, because everybody has this minimum threshold, right? Where for example, if I ever see a Corvold hit the battlefield, I know from experience that I need to kill it immediately. And there are certain commanders that need to fly under that radar in order to, be good. Or rather, I should rephrase that as there are certain commanders that do fly under the radar, and that's because they are good, because they're just below that threshold where somebody will, see that on the board and think, hey, that's pretty good card, but it's not threatening a game end right now. And so I'm going to wait. We're going to wait and see, how the situation develops. And so you want to be in that position where your commander is just dangerous enough to stay on the board while also generating you value. And so that's why I don't think you should in casual pods. I mean, well, for pub stomping, first of all, you shouldn't run like Chulane type of decks. But also, I just think that you'll have a better time as well because your commander won't be targeted immediately. And you want to be the third deck to pop instead of the first or the second. So hot take number 4. And rounding us out here, we have hot take number 5. Opposition Agent and Even Mind Sensor should be run in most, if not all, decks that can play them. Now, I do not personally run Opposition Agent and Even Mind Sensor for fun factor, but for power, I think that they should be run in every single deck that can play them. The reason why is that tutoring runs rampant in EDH. People love to ramp in green. I mean, when have you ever seen a game that doesn't have green at the table that's searching out lands from their deck? And people love to search for their win cons, right? Eliminating variance is a large part of Commander. And so to have these anti-tutor stacks pieces shut down that part of the game while also not snuffing out, I guess you could say, the fun of the rest of the game, I think puts them in a very favorable spot for earning a slot within decks. Just be aware that these cards do put a target on your back, but they are incredibly good at shutting down all of the, I guess, BS that you might find in Commander. Personally, I think you should have to draw into your win con. This is my personal opinion. Instead of just being able to search for it with Demonic Tutor, I think that Demonic Tutor is an incredibly egregious card to be in the format. The spirit of Commander is about variance and fun and seeing all of your deck. It's singleton for a reason, right? You want to see all of these different effects. And to simply tutor out the same card every game is, in my opinion, not fun, while also being very powerful. And so to shut this down, I think is a great idea. And I would simply ask, when is the last time you've played a game of Commander where at least 3 tutors have not happened throughout throughout the course of the game, right? Somebody's going to be on green ramping out lands. We already know that. Somebody's going to be casting a demonic tutor to search for their, Turgrid or Creative Behemoth or whatever. And this is just not acceptable because the more powerful creature effects we get that can end the game, the more powerful removal we need and or to prevent those cards from hitting the field in the first place. And so that's where Opposition Agent and Avid Mindsetzer, in my opinion, fall into the removal category, I suppose, because you are shutting down that shortcut to victory that you know that your opponents are going to play, right? I mean, how many artifact tutors do we have? Artifact decks make use of that. And any black deck is going to be running all of the variants of the tutors, depending on the brewer's stance. Whether they run tutors is ultimately up to them, but you are going to encounter tutoring over the course of the game, and I just think that these are absolutely needed to shut down the two most powerful things that people are doing in Commander, which is ramping and playing or searching for their biggest bombs. And so these are aces in the hole for that. That is my hot take number 5. And then I just like to end the video on a non-EDH hot take. Of course, I will have more of these hot takes. I actually have a notepad with a bunch of these written down. I have at least 2 more videos in store for you guys that I will make in the upcoming weeks, where we will go through around 10 more hot takes. I'll probably do 5 per video, but in each of these, I'm going to end the video on a non-Commander related hot take, and that is that hot dogs are a bottom tier food, and I honestly think they're more equivalent to dog food than to human food. And if you guys have ever seen how hot dogs are made, you will realize what goes into a hot dog and the fact that they use red or pink dye, I think, to make the meat look the way it does. This stuff actually starts out as white mush, essentially. If you look at any hot dog making video, it's just this gelatinous mush that gets dyed and then cooked into this amalgamation of mostly fat. There's not actually a lot of protein content in hot dogs, but the parts of the animal that hot dogs are made of are not appetizing at all. And I just encourage you to do your own research on the origin of hot dogs. And I think that you might agree with me, but personally, hot take, I would be happy to never eat a hot dog for the rest of my life. I think they're just bottom tier food, and I'm happy to not have them in my life whatsoever. So let me know what you think about that. Also in the comments below, I'm ready to do some verbal sparring with y'all over these hot takes. And so I hope we have a civil, friendly discussion in the comments. And with that, I will end the video. So again, if you like this video, leave a like on it and subscribe if you want to see more magic content by me. And hopefully we will see you all in the next video.